So my name is Koichi Mikami, and Mark said there are several new faces in the room, and I think I'm one of them. I just joined STIS and ISSTI last January, working on Steve's project on making genomic medicine. And also I finished my PhD 4 years ago, so I'm not in the position to think about like bridging different kind of disciplines, but I'm going to talk about my own research and how I dealt with different perspectives within it. So this talk is based on my previous work on regenerative medicine, and it could be two different projects. One is a comparative study of tissue engineering in the UK and Japan, which I conducted for my PhD. And then after I went back to Japan, and I was looking at the policy science dynamics in the Japanese context. So these are the things that I'm going to talk about. And here I'm going to present some reflections of the process of entering a field and also staying in the field or exploring the field. And I want to discuss my choice of science technology studies over innovation studies. So this is slightly different from other people's talk, I guess. Before I go into the details, I just want to talk about what I mean by innovation studies. As Robin said, the boundary of these disciplines are not very clear, but there are certain ideas about what it means by what I mean by the innovation studies, but it's not necessarily much what you expect as the innovation studies. So for me, innovation studies involve some kinds of assessment of performance. So when you're choosing what case to study, that you are kind of looking at well-performing, the successful cases. So try to learn something from them. But also you might be choosing the failure cases and identifying the problems, so learning from that experience as well. So that is a kind of performance assessment going on there. And also, the innovation studies tend to assume that there are some degrees of cross-case comparability and transferability. So if you are studying the UK context, for example, then you kind of think, okay, then how do you apply to think about US or Australia, Japanese context? So there is some kind of comparativity built into the study itself. And innovation studies, not necessary, but it often talks about models and systems. And it kind of signals that it involves abstraction by labeling or categorizing the actors. For example, you talk about like pharmaceutical sector or like academia, science. So these kind of things tend to go on. Innovation studies tend to be prescriptive rather than descriptive, and tend to concern about how we can do better in making innovations or bringing better economic consequences kind of things. So that's what I see as innovation studies. So now going back to what I was studying, then it was 2006 when I was entering the field. And the field that I was entering was called tissue engineering. And this term was commonly used from late 1990s to early 2000s. Now that people talk more about regenerative medicine. But this picture is called noodle mouse, and this is kind of symbolic picture. So one of the scientists in the US put the ear, tissue engineered ear in the back of the mouse. But it's not grown in the mouse. It was like created in a lab and put it back in it. But this picture itself kind of symbolizes what kind of things they were trying to do. And this picture was quite used often in the presentations in many places. And because this was done earlier than the human embryonic stem cell lines were established, the human embryonic stem cells could be used, but it's not necessarily the case. People were talking about different kind of stem cells. So it's slightly different from what you might think of as regenerative medicine. But my aim to enter the field was to understand the relationship between its development, so how this scientific field is developing, and its relationship to its socio-political context by conducting comparative studies. So I was looking at Japan and the UK. So what I did was, because I was based in the UK, that I tried to enter the UK field first. And doing like website searches, and there are several various people associated with this field. So It could be a professorial title, so a professor in tissue engineering. There are several people claiming that, and also there are several projects going on using the term tissue engineering. And also, there is institutions working on tissue engineering. So these were the people using the word tissue engineering. But by choosing who to interview for, then I decided to go to this International Society for Tissue Engineering and Regenerative Medicine. This is really international society. But then the European chapter at the time was holding the annual meeting in London. So by these people, the participants of these meetings were, they manifesting their involvement in the field. So it's not me choosing these individuals, but them decided to be part of this field. So that's how I was trying to do the interviews. So my strategy was to start from the participants and then identify a relevant individual to interview by snowballing strategy. And then what I saw was that this field consisted of a really wide range of actors. So it involved the stem cell scientists. Some people are bioengineers, so they have a bioengineering background, not necessarily dealing with the stem cells, but looking at scaffold, which is the cells are based on. And also medical and clinical scientists working on the application side of it. And the funding agencies, MRC, EPSRC, BBSRC were funding some of the research. And then in the UK, the significant one was the UK Stem Cell Bank, which is supposedly providing stem cells to the researchers and the business people. But interestingly, even though they claim that they are dealing with the whole range of stem cells, they are only dealing with human embryonic stem cells now. So far, I don't know whether they will expand that scope, but after 10 years, they are still working only on human embryonic stem cells. And there are several startup companies and also large pharmaceutical companies were there, but they're not necessarily thinking about medical applications. They might be using that for the toxicology or different reasons. And also non-pharmaceutical companies, again, like cosmetics area, they are using these tissue engineering approach for toxicology and effectiveness test kind of things. So there are very diverse actors in the field. And because there are so many people in the field, there are no agreed upon definition of tissue engineering, even though the regenerative medicine was available, and this was documented by some other people too. And yet, the importance of human embryonic stem cell is widely recognized. So even though they're not directly working on human embryonic stem cells, they were claiming that, okay, this research now they are doing will build towards the future use of human embryonic stem cells. So there is interesting conversation going on. But at the same time, they were claiming that they are not working on it, they are ethical. So there is different kinds of justification of their work going on. So after I looked at the UK context, then I moved to the Japanese context, but which was quite difficult. One of the issue I had was, so I was again trying to identify the people as somehow affiliated with this tissue engineering, but the term tissue engineering, the direct translation of the term could be the same translation from organizational engineering, which is the kind of field looking at the business context and try to human resource issues, that kind of things. So people are trying to avoid that confusion, so not using the term. So there's less people involved in tissue engineering as such. So what I did then was try to look at the International Society for Tissue Engineering and Regenerative Medicine, so the same society, and they also have this Asian Pacific Charter. And they were holding a meeting in Tokyo, so that was great. So I went there, but unlike the UK meeting, they were not providing a list of participants. So I never know who were there. Like I can see from the presentations, but I wasn't able to go every single presentations. So there was no way that I can know who's actually in the main actors in the field. So my alternative strategy was to start from the scientists introduced by the UK interviewees, then trying to do the snowballing strategy again. And what happened was that the field turned out to be a relatively closed community, so much less diversity than what I saw in the UK. And mainly the bioengineers are the active participants in the field. Then they are collaborating with medical and clinical scientists and startup companies. There are only few, but there are. And so this observation made me wonder why some actors present in the UK context were missing in the Japanese context. Then I realized that there is a separate community, which is they call themselves regenerative medicine, and they consist of stem cell scientists and medical clinical scientists, but not so many of the bioengineers or the startup companies. So there are two different kind of communities working on the field, which was united in the UK context, but they were very different in the Japanese context. And interestingly, this Japanese regenerative medicine, each of these two communities has its own world-class invention. So one of which is the cell sheet engineering. That was for the tissue engineering community, but this is the way that you culture cells as a layer and try to create the tissue or even the organ. The issue at the time was that you cannot create three-dimensional tissue because you have to deliver nutrition and oxygen to the cells to grow them. But if you try to create the three-dimensional, then the cells inside the material won't get enough nutrition or oxygen, so that they were having difficulties. But this cell sheet engineering was able to do it by actually compiling the layers of the cells. So this is one really interesting technology. Then the other one was cell reprogramming, and this was for the regenerative medicine community. And this is really famous iPS. Shinya Yamanaka produced this iPS cells. So this is pluripotent cells. It looks like a human embryonic stem cells, but it's less of the ethical considerations. So these are the two really interesting inventions, and each of them has its own community. But then later, the iPS cell was receiving much greater public and policy attention in Japan. But it's not about their significance, but it was significant how it was received in international science community and also how it was received by the international socio-political environment. So the Bush in the States was making some claims that we are not funding the human embryonic stem cell research, but iPS cell could be the way to do it. So all these kind of comments will influence the way the Japanese policymakers are deciding their funding strategies, and they are focusing more on the iPS cell strands. So at the end, the government was willing to make policy decisions for regenerative medicine rather than tissue engineering. So the two communities, each of them has got their own inventions, but one of them receiving more attention than the other, one of them receiving more funding and regulatory kind of favors than compared to the other sides. And if look at these communities, they have different technological trajectories. So tissue engineering was all about the production of tissues as therapeutic devices. So emphasis was placed on the product itself. So they are producing these products and putting into the market. And potentially the mass production of these products could achieve the economy of scale effect. And then there is idea of user-friendly. So user here is the clinicians. So try to accommodate the kind of practices now Christians are using. So transplantation is one of the ways. So if you can produce the kind of products that could fit into their practice, then it could be sold more. So that gets market advantage. At the same time, these companies and bioengineers try to train clinicians in a way that they can use these technologies. So there is interesting interaction going on there. Regenerative medicine is slightly different. Production tissue was a medical procedure. So emphasis is more on the process itself. And potentially the standardization will achieve the economy of scope effect. So for example, the Yamanaka is talking about creating a cell bank, then you are using the similar materials that will ease the pain of dealing with the cells because you are using the same materials, the characters are similar. Even though you are trying to apply that to this different patient, you can approach it in the similar way. So the idea of user-friendly is here, but the user here is more focused. The idea of user is a patient. So how to remove the pain of the patients, how patients could be more comfortable by using these technologies. So different notions of users are embedded in different trajectories. And the government support was also different. So for the tissue engineering community, the support came from Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry because they were focusing on the mass production and very market-driven type of approach. And they were encouraging commercial engagement. And eventually, so this is like market logic. Eventually, business actors have to bring the success to the field. Then we also have the Ministry of Education in collaboration with Ministry of Health, providing support to regenerative medicine field. And this was seen as a potential improvement of medicine. Interestingly, their joint research funding, for example, talk about clinical applications, but they are thinking about clinical trials and when we can prove the clinical utility of these technologies rather than thinking about how can this technology fit into the medical systems, not thinking about inviting pharmaceutical companies, not thinking about how to economize the use of these things. So there are different ways, different people funding different kinds of strategies, and they were significantly different. So this is the kind of experiences I had with studying regenerative medicine. So my question here is how to study the technology which is in the making, not already made. So I was looking at 2 different countries, but there are 3 different technologies. So I can't even, it's very difficult to compare the Japanese and UK context, but then I was still comparing 2 different communities within Japan as well. And I talked about 2 different inventions, but I don't know whether they can be called innovations. They are different technologies, but what is the criteria to call them innovations? Is it something that I can call them or something that other people has to call them? And also, I wasn't quite sure what does the boundary of the technology sit. So who the main actors, who brought these actors together, and what roles they are expected to play. They are significantly different. Business actors are different, have the different roles. Clinicians have different roles in different communities. And also how to evaluate. So some people ask me like which community is doing better. I'm not quite sure what do we mean by better. If we can produce more, then is it better? Or is it, if we can do it faster, is it better? Or from the STS kind of view, like it could be better if the field itself is more flexible, adapting different kind of perspectives. So different ways of evaluating things, but I'm not quite sure how to choose them. And to what extent can cases travel? And there's some discussion about historical contingency. So comparing Japan and UK and how far you have to go back to compare them and to make sure that this is the cases, you can call them as a case, concrete case. And also I was troubled by the linguistic specificity. Talking about tissue engineering isn't simple in 2 different contexts. Maybe it was simpler if I was comparing like US, UK, given that they are using the same language. But yeah. So my choice of STS over innovation studies, it's because I saw that it's, even though it's descriptive, that this offers, STS offers flexibility in dealing with 2 distinctly different cases and paying attention to their local specificity and historical contingency. And also, STS kind of prevents the generalized labels categories from considering the important difference among the actors involved. So I can talk about different ministries, not talking about the governments. If you, so there are different ways of calling these actors, but if I was to compare a government as a government, then it conceals some of the important differences. And STS may not suggest what to do, but it still indicates the potential pitfalls to be avoided. This is the kind of things that we can learn from. There are still something we can learn from doing STS research. And also, one of the issues I had was with innovation studies is that some innovation models are well adapted in the policy domain. And people actually talk about, okay, linear models or national innovation systems, triple helix models, all these things were discussed within the policy domain. And I wasn't quite sure by adopting innovation studies approach, how do I see that kind of the local use of these innovation studies insights, and how do I reflect that in my study? So that was a kind of challenge that I had. So here that I know that I wasn't delivering really well, but I was trying to deliver two different levels of distributions of responsibility. One is within the context, so different roles that each actor is expected to play. So even the government, even though we call it government, the Japanese government, the way the Japanese government works and the UK government works is very different, and different institutions are there. So how do we make sense? It's very challenging. The other challenge really is the distribution responsibility in its analysis, and how to identify the case. Why do we choose this is a really interesting case to study, and who's the one who's actually assessing that kind of performances? And what kind of levels of abstraction is appropriate. So you might want to talk about regional context, you might want to talk about national context, but what is the basis we choose this? And also, what is the lessons we can learn from studying these cases? We can tell the story, but at the same time, should we prescribing some kind of lessons, or should we let the policymakers decide what was the lessons in my studies are? So there are two different approaches, and I feel more comfortable to have less me in the study, to have others, so others decide what is the context, what others people decide what is the important field to study. All these kinds of, I don't really think that I can eliminate totally, but still I will feel more comfortable eliminating me from the study. So that is my experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, very interesting. Question?